Welcome to this edition of the Imagery International podcast series. We hope you find it interesting. ImageryInternational.org.
This will be our last telechat for 2010. What we are looking for in the future is doing interviews, and those will be downloadable. So our first guest for 2011 will be Dr. Andrew Wagner, and I believe that his talk is going to be on imagery and the end-of-life care. So now to the exciting part. Well, all of it's exciting, but for tonight, we have Juliet Rohde-Brown. Juliet not only is a dear friend, but she is a distinguished doctor of clinical psychology, and she is certified as an imagery practitioner with AGI. Juliet, and tonight your topic is going to be on forgiveness and imagery, or vice versa, imagery and forgiveness. And I believe you're going to share ways in which imagery can provide us a pathway for forgiveness to process and blossom within us. So can we start maybe with some definitions, like what is forgiveness and how is that different from condoning?
Absolutely, and hello everyone. Thank you for being on the call. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I love talking about this topic because I think that both imagery and forgiveness are the crucial elements to heal this world, really, and all of our relationships and our relationships with ourselves, too. So I do think it's important to start with some definitions because there are lots of different ideas about what forgiveness is and some assumptions, too. If we look at the literature and the research on forgiveness, there really are 4 different categories that it can kind of fall into in terms of definitions. There's, number 1, that it's actually an overt act that occurs between people. Number 2, that it simply exists in the psychosocial realm, in the social world. And number 3, that it's a process. And number 4, that it's learning, that anyone can learn it. I choose a definition, although I really like the aspect of learning, and that's Fred Luskin's work that is so important to me. He's one of my mentors, and I just love his work. The definition that I choose to work with is a definition that states that forgiveness is a process. And I choose it. It's from the researchers and clinical psychologists Enright and Fitzgibbon. And I'd really like to read that definition because I think it locks it in a really nice way. So allow me to just quote. I'm going to start now, quote, "People, upon rationally determining that they have been unfairly treated, forgive when they willfully abandon resentment and related responses to which they have a right and endeavor to respond to the wrongdoer based on a moral principle of beneficence, which may include compassion, unconditional worth, generosity, and moral love, to which the wrongdoer, by nature of the hurtful act or acts, has no right," unquote. So you see, according to this definition, forgiveness is a process. It's not a technique or an overt act that takes place only in the social realm, but it's a really complex process, and it's one in which we can even say that ethics, from a broader philosophical perspective, comes into play. And through this process and through imagery, we can come to understand, to respect, to adhere to this concept of basic human goodness. if you will. So we can learn to soften our heart toward ourselves or toward someone we're having, or even a political party or some broader idea that may not be considered deserving of our forgiveness, and yet we extend it nevertheless. And so we start with sort of an uncovering. What is it that we want to work on? What is it that we want to forgive? And then we work toward making a decision to forgive. Then we do the practices, the work, the reminder, and this deepens our relationship with ourselves. It deepens our sense of compassion, softens our heart, and we internalize those insights that we've gained. And so it's a transformational process. And as we let go of resentment, even when we have, some people would say, a right to be resentful or angry, it's just a stance of creating a friendlier attitude, even though the offender may not be, quote unquote, maybe worthy of forgiveness. So, and then you asked about how it's different from condoning.
Yes.
And it's different in that forgiveness does not have to involve reciprocity or even contact with the perpetrator. It's expressive, though, as an intention, an intention of beneficence. And that intention is, well, it's kind of like we can think of it as a verb, in that it is extended outwards toward the offender. The difference between forgiveness of another and forgiveness of oneself is that in the case of forgiveness of the self, there does have to be kind of a reciprocal kind of thing, because we have to be able to accept that within ourselves. So it does require that meeting back with ourselves. So anyway, but really it's an intention. It's an intention that may have behavioral consequences, and that's wonderful if it does. But it doesn't mean go back to an abusive relationship or something like that. Nevertheless, one can extend forgiveness in spite of being angry and everything else. They can extend a forgiving stance, a forgiving attitude toward just about anyone or anything. So that's the definition, kind of a long-winded one, but I like to be clear on that, because it does not mean that you're condoning actions at all. At all. In fact, it's a very active stance in really, really calling people on their integrity and calling ourselves on our integrity. And so it doesn't mean to get back with a relationship necessarily. Yeah.
Right. I was wondering, in your book that you wrote, I know that each of the chapters of your book, that you use the acronym of IMAGINE, and I was wondering what those letters stood for.
Okay. I start every chapter with a letter that spells out IMAGINE for the 7 chapters. And so the first chapter I talk about imagine considering forgiveness. And then I bring up these definitions and things like that. And then the second chapter begins with M, and I talk about metta and mindfulness in forgiving ourselves and others. And the process of mindfulness is breathing and starting with our breath, and then catching our thoughts, watching them, not being attached to them, and watching them pass, just like seismic activity or something in the earth. It's going to change, and just watching it and getting in that process. And metta is another practice which I can describe in a moment. And by the way, that's a very, very brief definition of mindfulness, but I think a lot of people listening know what that is. And then the A is activating forgiveness through our feelings. Because really it's through our feeling center that we're going to be able to go to that depth, to really be able to make some changes. And then the G is grounding forgiveness in our bodies. And we all know, as imagery practitioners, how important that is. And then the I is inventing a joyful future with imagery. So the I kind of stands for this possibility of a joyful future in using imagery. And then the N is nurturing this intention that we have. And through rituals, through the forgiveness ceremony, I present an actual kind of ritual or ceremony in the book that can be done over a 12-week process or shorter time or longer time. But I present it as a 12-week process. And then the E is engaging global neighborliness, I call it, as a collective forgiveness idea and process. So then I spell out imagine, and because that really is our greatest resource. It all starts with the imagination, as we all know. All of us on this call. That's why we're on this call, because we all share this belief, this deep knowing that it's through our imagination that we make changes, the most profound changes for ourselves, for others, for this planet.
So I was just wondering, you mentioned ceremony and natural environment and practices. Can you tell how those interrelate and tell us a little more about that?
Yes, and I want to say that those of us who are on this call and we do this imagery work, the work that we're all doing really does create forgiveness. And I think everyone on the call can validate that. When we're working with clients, when we're working with ourselves in these processes, we notice that we change our way of being in the world. The more we work with imagery, the more we work with being in a compassionate, loving relationship with ourselves and others, well, that is forgiveness. And so I really believe that if people are calling in and they're working with imagery, they're already doing this work. But there are explicit practices that I know have really helped me and other people. And it starts with grounding in the breath, as we all know, just especially the belly breath. And I think grounding any kind of imagery practice, first of all, in a mindfulness practice, where you're just watching, you're following the breath and then slowing down and then watching the thoughts, and having them pass and naming them even and just letting them pass, and then going into that place of insight and internal world. And then I think grounding any imagery practice in the loving-kindness meditation, which is also referred to as metta meditation in the Pali language and that sort of thing. But we can call it loving-kindness meditation because that's the English definition, the closest definition that one can have of that. And that's where it's such a beautiful imagery practice. Before we even go into the special place and the interactive kind of imagery that many of us do, we can ground it with again, starting with the mindfulness and the breath, and then seeing. We can bring in our wise guide that people have already established often, or if they haven't done that yet, they can establish just a sense of something like that coming in, or people can use someone they really love and see their face. If it helps to see a child or even an animal or a place in nature that they truly love and they know they can feel safe with and receive that love back, then they ground themselves coming from their heart. They can even put their hand over their heart, and then really receiving that, giving that out, getting into that circle of heart-centeredness and breathing deeply and evenly. And then they move that stance because now the person is feeling that sense of compassion, that sense of a more forgiving stance, and they then move it to other people in their lives, other loved ones and friends and other people they might work with. And then when they start getting really used to this process, they can bring somebody in who they're having a very difficult time with and see their face show up in front of them. And that may be difficult to do. It may even be their own face. Often we want to start with our own face if we can feel that love for ourselves, but people can have difficulties with that too. So they can just try and not beat themselves up if other things come up, but go then immediately to the loving place. And so it's this process of replacing these images in front of you who can reinforce that loving heart-centeredness and building the practice so that more and more people, events, political parties, things that are happening in the world, past incidents, can show up and be treated in that same way of heart-centeredness. And it doesn't mean that one gives up, legitimate feelings of anger and all of that. But in spite of it, it's a gift to one's body. It's a gift to oneself. And then finally opening it up to our neighborhood, our city, our nation, the world, all sentient beings. And so those two are very grounding practices. The second one involves imagery. And I think they can set us up for then doing some really nice interactive imagery work that we all do and that sort of thing. And I think the idea of bringing in the wise guide, as we do in our own imagery practices, is very, very helpful. And now there's research to back that up, too. There's a researcher, I know one of the names is Doug Ullman, who is validating the sense of self-efficacy when we actually bring in a more spiritual figure. And Jack Kornfield uses that in his work. Try on what it's like to even be that person. What would that image, it could be Jesus, it could be Kuan Yin, it could be a favorite aunt who was very, very wonderful toward you. So those are grounding practices. And then we work with the person in that interactive way, too. Yes, and because, too, what it does, there's research to back up the benefits of forgiveness also in the body. When we soothe our feelings of hostility by loving kindness meditation, by forgiveness, we all know that we provoke the parasympathetic nervous system, and it literally calms and soothes the body. And then our body works more efficiently. It sustains our health rather than impairing it. And now there's this new talk about mirror neurons. And these neurons fire when we watch someone else, say, scratch their head or wipe away a tear or something like that. And then we also know about entrainment, the same type of idea that these waves mirror those of the senders. So if we're sending out forgiveness toward ourselves, toward another, we're literally changing our cellular structure, we could say, And imagine that. It's just, it really makes me excited to think about that.
Right, and with all the benefits of the imagery and the forgiveness, are there some hidden health hazards for a lack of forgiveness?
Yes, and I mean, I think we can all try on what it's like to feel vengeance. If we hold our fists, we can all try that right now. Just tighten our fists, tighten our jaw. Don't breathe, put your shoulders up and just kind of hold that for a minute. And we know that when we have vengeance and rumination in our body, that's what we're doing to ourselves. That's what we're doing to ourselves over and over. So if we just release it and let go of the hands, let go of the jaw, put your shoulders down, breathe through your belly. And what that does to us instantly, that's what forgiveness does to our body too. That's what a compassionate stance does for us, for our health. It allows us to breathe deeply and gently, calmly. It allows us that inner sense of confidence, and some may even say a more mature kind of spirituality. I feel better when I just did that. I was doing it as I was describing what to do, and it just feels so good to let that go. But that's what rumination is doing too. It's called monkey mind, the Buddhists call it, just over and over and over again, like a spinning wheel, like a hamster in a cage. And then that tightening of thinking about either the past or the future and not really being in the moment. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not implying that this is easy either, because it's like I said, it's a process. And we all know that just when we think we're coming around the curve, we might come back again. So that's why I imagine it like a spiral, not a linear process at all, but more like a spiral, and that we have to be gentle with ourselves as we cross the spiral of forgiveness, and know that when we dip back a little bit, it's okay, because we're coming back around the next end of the spiral. And we need to be exactly where we are and just give ourselves a little bit of the next curve, try to edge ourselves a little bit around that next curve, because the next spiral is going to take us around a new curve. And each time we're not forgetting what happened in the past. It never leaves our memory or our story of who we uniquely are, but we can sort of include and transcend the past. So we can really be in the moment and transcend all of these past ruminations about what happened, and blame, whether it's blaming ourselves or others. So I don't know, on this call if these are practical pieces that would be helpful. I hope so. When we get into the discussion section, I guess we could talk more about that.
Yes, and I'm wondering before, because it's almost time for us to do that, to go to open it up. But I was just wondering, for those of us who are listening, are there any resources, particular resources that in the process of the forgiveness that we can use to allow us to stay on, I'm going to say on the path, so to speak, to give us reinforcement in moving through the practices of forgiveness?
Yes, well, I love Fred Luskin's work, forgiveforgood.com. I think it's called, and I don't have it in front of me, but anybody who could Google Fred Luskin and his work, he has some good practices. I love the work of Meredith Young Sowers with the Still Point Foundation also, www.stillpointfoundation.org, and people can look up Enright and Fitzgibbons for that work. Imagery International and the practitioner list. If people are new to Imagery International, go on the website and check out the list of practitioners, because you will find that if you're new to imagery and you want to work with it, that you will automatically start moving into a more loving and forgiving place. I did forget to mention that the ceremony I do talk about in my book is where we're actually working with objects and creating kind of a lamentation, if you will, for the actual first piece, which is the acceptance piece, because we can't make any changes until we accept things first, right? So that first piece I sort of call creating a lamentation, kind of a paradoxical phase of accepting emotional pain as a function of change. Kind of in the acceptance is also a letting go, or even destruction of the part that we held on to, that we attached to the pain. I guess we can conceive of it as a death of the old pattern that we're starting to be in the process of, and then a descent, and that's where we work with the inner world of feelings and associations, and build a foundation for our re-entry, if you will, to the world. So I have this ceremonial basket that can be used with some objects and to go into that deep, relaxed, or we don't even necessarily want to say relaxed, but altered state or highly attuned state, and gather some contents and then close one's eyes to see what comes out, what you pull out of it, and hold it even before opening the eyes, and let it tell you a story a little bit, and then journal about that. And then I like to bring in movement, sound, a poem, something that involves the body, where you can move with this exploration, and then in an emergence, which is a new phase that brings us into the consciousness of forgiveness, and a mantra that we can develop for ourselves that reminds us all the time that we've made this intention and that we're developing a specific mantra for it, almost like filled with the joy and wonder and acceptance of a newborn child, if you will, the emergence in that new child. So it's kind of a 3-tiered process, but I've positioned it as a 12-week process. And if it's done in a group, then people can share, and there's something very, very magical, as we all know, about being in a group. Talk about the mirror neurons and the entrainment and all of that. It's very powerful to be witnessed like that, and to use imagery like that in a group process, and particularly when we involve imagery and objects from the natural earth, and that we go outside and we're with the natural environment and our relationship to that as well. So I had forgotten to mention that, so I wanted to mention that. In my book, I have some stories, too, and perhaps some of the participants this evening have some stories that they could share as well. Or some of them, I'm interested to, I think we're kind of getting close to that part where we'll be in dialogue with others. And if other people have some work that they would like to share as well, and some revelations and maybe some stories and what they've found to work or not work, that's what we're all here for. It's wonderful. It's a tele-chat where we can share these things. Those are the things that have worked for me. Sometimes not even explicitly talking about forgiveness per se, but facilitating that process with a client in making them more loving toward themselves, first of all. Mm-hmm.
Right. So it sounds like this might be a good time for us to invite people to push *6 to unmute, and let's open it up to everyone.
Hey, this is Beverly.
Hi, Beverly.
Hi, 2 things. One, what is the name of your book, and how can one get a copy? I'm guessing besides Amazon, maybe that's the only way, but what's the name of the book?
Oh, okay, thank you. It is Imagine Forgiveness, a guide for creating a joyful future.
All right, and are you the single author?
Yes.
Very good, okay. Then I did want to share a story about forgiveness and how I implement a lot of what you've said and how I do view it as well as a process, if I can take that time.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
You're welcome. I have a labyrinth on my property. I have built a labyrinth, and if you're familiar with them, they are actually a process of letting go. And how I utilize it is when I'm walking, I set an intention, and often that's come with lots of visualization and thought. And so I have used it to actually work on forgiveness and the pain of relationship that was falling apart, etc. So walking in is releasing. So I'm wanting to release the pain. And then when you get to the center, that's where one receives, which hopefully is the peace and compassion and all the things that we want to achieve in the forgiveness process. And then in walking out, you are carrying out, and there's another R here that's totally blanking in my head, but anyway, you're walking out and you're living what you've learned, and hopefully are a changed person. So
Oh, that's beautiful.
Return. I think it's return. So in this one case, I was mourning and trying to understand the loss of this relationship, and I got to the center, so I'm crying as I'm walking in, feeling the sadness, and I get to the center, and I stay there for a while, and I have a beautiful conch shell in the center of my labyrinth, and there was a dead leaf in there. And for me, that brought to mind, this is the death of the relationship, the death of something beautiful, but it's being held within something beautiful. I mean, it was just really amazing. But that gift in and of itself was worth the whole process. And coming back out, then there was a little hummingbird flying by with some nesting material in its mouth, beak rather, and was going to go make the nest. So it was creating, and it was a new beginning. And it was amazing how all of that stuff plugs in when one spends the time meditating and visualizing and then going through that process. And subsequent to that, it's relief, and release. So releasing, receiving, and returning. That's the 3 R's of it.
Releasing, receiving, and returning. That's beautiful.
I love
That's
it.
a beautiful story. I love that.
Thanks for allowing me to share it.
And I was thinking, we have in school, we have the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, with a play on words that are so basic to all learning. I like to think of this in the same way, the 3 R's, release, receiving, returning, for our health and happiness in this process of forgiving, and also in other ways. That's beautiful.
Yes, that truly is. And when you said that Bev, when you spend the time to do these things, it truly, when I heard Jung's statement, when I read that about when you turn your face to the deep unconscious, then all these gifts come back to you. If you just turn your face to it, the gifts of this spiritual relationship truly come back, and then we can receive by just opening that door. And how beautiful! As you were talking about the labyrinth, I was imagining you and others walking along that spiral and that conch shell. It's exactly what I'm talking about, working with the natural environment and using the objects, but also deepening the process with the breathing and the imagery practices. But you've got that live image of the labyrinth right there every day that you look at, I guess, as you go in and out of your home. I just love that, the symbol of that, It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had an idea, too, just thinking about the labyrinth, that taking it from, that we could do that even in places where we don't have the labyrinth, by just imagining the labyrinth and imagining ourselves walking through it, just in an imagery.
Mm-hmm.
I think the grounding is richer, but I'm thinking in those times when we are between places.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, imagining it, yes. But it is helpful to use the body and actually get up and move with things and make sounds and things. Do you all find that too? Do others on the call find that you might do this yourself or ask others to make sound or to move a little bit with the imagery that they're working with? What are your thoughts about that? Other people, I'm curious.
I'll pipe in. This is Sue.
Okay. Hi,
Two
Sue.
things is hi. You're just so wonderful, Juliet.
Thank
and hi,
you.
everybody else. So just a couple thoughts. Yeah, there is something about actually walking the labyrinth, and there is something also about, there's a finger labyrinth, there's, using your imagination. And I just want to say my yoga teacher today just was commenting on, and this is so related to forgiveness, she was saying about when we're holding on to something and when we're tense, it creates a blocked energy, and it's really all about letting go. And when we let go, then energy can flow through us, and we're also connected with the universal flow of energy. And I think that's so related and true with forgiveness, too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for saying that. So true. Yes. Yes. Yes, it's such a... Go ahead, Judith. Go ahead.
I'm just going to invite other people or other comments around that.
Well, this is Doreen. As I'm listening,
hi, Doreen.
Hi.
Hi,
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, when I'm asked to imagine, when I'm asked to move, when I'm asked to make sound, sometimes that is very scary. Whether it's for me or for a client or for a group, all of a sudden I'm asked to participate in a way that our culture has subdued, unless you're on the dance floor or you're at a specific place. But just to take that as a naturally occurring thing with our physical bodies seems to be not so natural in our culture. And when we introduce it, it's like, can I actually do this? Can I actually embody this? What's going to happen? Things are going to change. So I find that both those things happen for myself at times and for others, that introducing that opportunity to shift into a different way of being is kind of takes their breath away.
Yes, that's really important, that we all have to be ready for each piece and go with exactly where we are because it's okay. And then as we try new things, and they are scary, and we go into the fear, amazing breakthroughs can happen. But you're right, our culture does not really honor these types of expressions.
Well,
and yet, go ahead.
No, I was thinking, when I do these expressions, my very first time experiencing this was 105 years ago, when I took up Jinshin Jitsu. All of a sudden, my body was moving. I was making sounds in ways that I hadn't thought of. That's like a martial arts. And I started to giggle, and I couldn't stop giggling. It was just this effervescent thing, and the more I giggled, the more the instructor got mad. This was serious business.
No.
I was the only female. I was more limber. I was 40. They were 20. It was crazy, but it was liberating. And he was just so upset because this was serious business, and the joy of me came up. And I think that happens for people too. They don't know what to do with this. All of a sudden, they're effervescent. Now what do you do?
That's a great story. Oh, that's a great story.
I think that happens to all of us. All of a sudden, we're liberated. And now what do we do? Because we don't fit back in that box again. So I think it's a wonderful tool, and it has lots of things around it.
I just love Bessel van der Kolk's work, and he's worked a lot with children with trauma, and this type of getting into the body and using the arts and describing, not explaining, but describing experience in the moment with all ages, but he's done some very, very special work that he's talking about a lot with teens, at-risk teens who've been through a lot of trauma, and using the art, using movement, using voice and journaling and describing, not explaining, but describing, as we do with our imagery work, describing what the present experience, and it seems to create major breakthroughs, and almost like we can say, as Dan Siegel does, that we're reintegrating our brain. But, Dan Siegel talks about interpersonal neurobiology, and how when we're in attunement with another, with ourselves, that we're truly we're integrating ourselves on all levels, on a cellular, on a neurotransmitter level. And for those who like to have some kind of proof or physical kind of validation for this work that we all love so much with imagery, well, there it is. We have that now. That's one of the benefits of technology. You know, I'm not a big technology fan because I'm not very good with it, but I do see the benefits in terms of communication and this validation that our work and the work Ruth Napastack is doing too with the people coming back from war and how imagery is getting validated for that kind of work too. And really that's work with forgiveness. When I was working in a psych hospital before, we would have some people coming in from war, you know, back from war, going back to the military base and feeling so horrible and guilty a lot of times and self-loathing and trying to use substances and things to numb that out. And the forgiveness process, self-forgiveness, it can be huge, huge with so many of these people who are returning now, and that hopefully we can make a difference in their lives as we work with them and they work with themselves, you know. So forgiveness crosses so many different avenues, doesn't it? It really does. So,
are there any other questions? Yeah, any other questions or comments?
Juliet, this is Sue again. I'm wondering if you could speak more towards the concept of self-forgiveness and how that might be the same. I think you've already addressed that, but how it might be different when in relation to forgiveness of another. Because a lot of times that's harder for someone than forgiving someone else.
That's so true. And I actually did a study on people going through divorce and forgiveness, and I did find that those who were not forgiving themselves were more kind of fixed in a place of trait anger as opposed to state anger, and it was more difficult for them to adjust to the divorce and to get over their depression and this kind of trait-like anger that turns into a worldview. It turns into a stance that is the expectations in the world. And the difference is that while forgiveness of others does not require a reciprocity, really, or contact with the perpetrator, the forgiveness of oneself does require that reconciliation, if you will, with the self. Reconciliation with the perpetrator is not necessary with forgiveness of another, but reconciliation with the self is. And it's the same stance of offering, even though it's not condoning what we did. If we know we made a mistake, for instance, okay, we made a mistake, and we need to be mindful of that mistake. But it doesn't have to define our existence, and so often it does. And again, this is something I saw a lot in a psych hospital with the younger people who would come in too and make one mistake in their early lives, and the guilt that surrounded that would lead them to believe that they were bad. So why not act bad? Why not do things that people think are socially reprehensible in the world? Why not become what I believe myself to be, this horribly reprehensible human being? And so the self-forgiveness is a huge part of that, and it does require a reconciliation of the remembering of the self, of our birthright, which is to be loving toward ourselves. So yeah, so that's the difference. Well, it's still a process, but it's a little bit different in that we do have to come back to ourselves and say, welcome, welcome back, and let me get to know you, and let me accept you, and where we don't necessarily have to be back in a relationship with a wrongdoer, a perpetrator from the outside. We do have to be back into a relationship with ourselves. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. That does make sense, and it makes sense from the empowerment that is given through the forgiveness so that you can get into a relationship with yourself and get your value from that relationship versus the other relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is Bev again, and I wanted to add something from a nonviolent communication perspective. Marshall Rosenberg. Actually, forgiveness is actually hardly in the vocabulary. You never need to really say you're sorry. But there is a forgiveness in that, and I can find more peace within myself because as you were saying, Sue, I find it's most difficult to forgive myself when I've made a mistake or done something that's less than meets my wants and needs. And it's to recognize that even while we are doing something that we really regret, we were doing it to meet a certain need. We may not like how we did it, but we had a genuine need we were trying to meet. And hopefully, as we learn and recognize, wow, I was trying to meet let's say I ran a stop sign. Oh my God, I broke the law. Because I was trying to meet my need, my strong need to be responsible and punctual for a meeting. My need was to be respectful of others and get to that meeting on time and meet those needs, while not meeting my needs for, I don't know what law-abiding stuff is, but to be what I consider a person with integrity, let's say, and a responsible person. So I didn't meet my needs for integrity and responsibility by running that stop sign. However, I was doing it because I was trying to meet some other needs. So
Right. So
that makes sense?
Yes, it does. And we do the best we can with the resources we have at any given moment, don't we?
Yes,
yeah. And I also, this work, I have to say, I'm not trying to come at this as some kind of guru who has all the answers. And I just know that these are things that have worked for me, and I'm just an average normal person too who happens to be working on this forgiveness piece and has learned some things along the way. And so for listeners, I certainly don't want to come across as a lecturing about forgiveness, because it is a process. And so I appreciate all of the input that you guys are bringing in too, because these are all such important pieces, and it helps to deepen that understanding of what a process forgiveness is. And me too. I've spent time in my life when I've had to forgive myself, and we tend to be hardest on ourselves, don't we? Like you just said. So, but we do the best we can with the resources, and that's why we do the imagery work. It gives us more resources. It gives our clients more resources. And it truly, truly transforms our lives. And working with forgiveness with the implicit intention to forgive. There's something about, isn't there, when we set an intention, but that intention in and of itself starts to create a life of its own, because we're putting out an attitude, a thought in the world. And if we truly feel authentic with that, we know that, like we said earlier, the world then responds in like. But we do the best we can at any given moment with the resources we have. And sometimes we didn't have the resources we have now when we reflect back on mistakes we may have made, or others may have made. Maybe they don't have the resources either. I often imagine a kind of a crying child with when a perpetrator has done kind of a horrible act, and I think about all of us and how we all came into this world wanting to be loved and to give love and all that. I mean, I like to believe that basic goodness stance, and I know that there are just heinous, reprehensible things that that we do in this world to other people, to our natural environment. But, you know, I like to believe in the idealistic notion of this remembrance of a basic sense of wonder and goodness and connection, and that we somehow can get lost along the way. But I do believe that most of us, if we put our intention there, can find a way back. I like to hold that. I hold that for myself. I hold that for others. It's really helped me in my life to transcend a lot of things. But I hold that for the people who I work with. I hold that sense of hope. And that's palpable when we hold that for ourselves and others. It's, you can feel it. You can almost touch it. You know, even though it's one of those non-local things, you can touch it. You can feel that energy of hope.
Is there time for more comments?
Well, yes, we can take time for one.
Okay, this is Donna.
Hi,
and
Donna.
I want to mention that I've really enjoyed this talk tonight. And one of the things that struck me is that I see it as a lifelong process. I've been forgiving myself for years and years now, and I probably will continue to forgive myself for years. And I'm continually forgiving others for years, and I just see it as something that will never be finished. Just that it will always be a constant part of my life. The need to forgive and the need to be forgiven.
And that describes the process, the giving and the receiving, the releasing and the returning, and new beginnings. What a wonderful thought for us to end on, and to continue to hold, as Juliet says, to hold the hope that is there for the forgiveness, for us, for others, and for what's going on in the world, to have hope for the world. Juliet, I think you did a superb job. It has been such a pleasure to be the moderator for this with you. And I want to thank all of the people who are here with us and who have joined us, and for all of your comments and the discussion that has followed. Do you have anything else to add, Juliet, before we close?
No, I share your thankfulness and gratitude for your graciousness, Judith, and moderating this call so beautifully, and all of the others who've shared, Donna and Sue and Doreen and Bev. And am I forgetting anyone? I certainly hope not. No, I don't think so. And just every piece that you shared, I think, just built this mosaic around what it is to forgive and what it is that we hold so dearly in this work that we cherish, that we all share this kind of work. And so thank you all, because each piece really built upon the topic, and there's so much more. For instance, Donna, in bringing up what it is to receive forgiveness, and we can save that for the future. Maybe we can do an entire call on receiving forgiveness. But that's what I have to say. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, and thank everybody else, too. And have a wonderful night. And thanks again so much for joining us.
Thank you for joining this Imagery International podcast. The music in this piece is provided by Shantha Shri. Find out more about our membership benefits, including our quarterly journal, at imageryinternational.org. Thank you for listening.